Hello and welcome to another episode of the iTnews podcast. On the show this week, we have CBA's Chief Digital Officer Fredrik Lindström and CIO for Technology at the bank's retail division and Distinguished Engineer Brendan Hopper. The result of that is a really wide-ranging conversation. You'll hear about CBA's transformation of its software engineering practices, its team and its culture. We also talk about what digital looks like beyond apps and online services, and where CBA's thinking is around future experiences and personalisation. Please enjoy the conversation.
We're in the same week as enterprise services being renamed to technology. And obviously I understand that's a reasonably important thing. I imagine it could take some getting used to in terms of saying the new name rather than enterprise services, which has been around for a long time. But I also imagine that technology is essentially a bit less limiting, if that's the right word, in terms of being a descriptor for the function now that there's a lot more to the technology operations at CBA. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts around the rebranding and the renaming to technology at all.
I think it's a reflection, at least for Brendan and I, technology is what we do. The operations component, it's very close to technology in the sense, and the two leverage each other very heavily. So I guess it's almost like two siblings of a family. But I think if you talk to just Brendan and I think we would see ourselves as technologists more than anything. So for us, it's just that perhaps we had a sibling that moved out of the house, but not really anything beyond that.
I think there's benefits with that sibling moving out too. It just makes what we do a lot clearer. And it means that there's a lot more conversations now that can be focused purely on making our technology better. I'm really excited about what that means, to have a technology leadership team that just talks and solves for technology rather than kind of both technology and ops. I think it's really good.
So let's move into some of the questions. Obviously, CBA has been in the news recently with the aim of recruiting 600 software engineers. And I just wondered if you can talk a little bit to the origins of that scheme, but also why now, because it's quite a challenging job market in terms of the conditions, and many organizations now are really having to pay up for technology skills. So I imagine it's quite a challenging time to launch such a big recruitment drive for specialist talent.
I've been with CBA for a year, and when I joined, one of the first things I did was to look at the ratio of engineers to non-engineers in my workforce. It was not at all where it needed to be. What I do is about digital, and most things digital translate into software, and most things software require an engineer somewhere to do something. So if you follow that and then look at what was the ratio that we had, it was probably down towards the high 30% numbers. If you still then believe in that to do digital, you need to produce software, it's probably not a good ratio. So to be productive, I figured we need to get to a much, much higher number. And so I launched that initiative very early on. And then Brendan and I have had a number of good conversations around how do we roll this out broadly to help the group raise the level of engineers that we've got. And we've been juggling a lot of numbers. Sometimes we talk about it as 500, sometimes as 600. I think both Brendan and I would agree that we would like to go much higher than that even. But it's a hard market, so we have to be somewhat realistic in what we can do. So we try to do the best we can. If we land north of 600 in the next year, I think we would both be pretty satisfied with that. So it's just a level of ambition to express the fact that we're upsizing significantly on engineering.
And I'd add, it's a hot market because lots of companies are doing it because it's the right and sensible thing to do. You have to do it to stay competitive in technology, and more technology is just really, really important, not just for us, but also for our customers. And our customers expect us to have outstanding tech, and they run their own businesses on technology too. So I think as the economy increasingly becomes more and more digital, it's going to be far more of a battlefield for engineering talent. And I think that that's ultimately quite good for the engineers too, because it means that organizations are trying to make sure that they've got the right workplaces, the right tools, the right culture where they actually want to work and be happy and be productive. I think ultimately that's going to be productive and useful for everyone.
So how do you go about winning that battle over for talent? So you mentioned a couple of things there like tools and culture, but do you want to give a little bit more of a sense of what CBA is building and how that might connect to attracting some of those people in?
I think, first of all, we're structuring ourselves the way a tech company does, like tribes and squads. And as much as possible, we're trying to align ourselves front to back so that engineering teams can be in control of their own products and feel a sense of pride in what they're building. and also as much as possible work independently. And so the structure's one, and the ability to work independently, the ability to spend most of their time on interesting problems and doing actual engineering. Like, engineers don't want to be consultants. They don't want to make PowerPoints. They don't want to go to meetings. So we're changing how we operate so that engineers are actually spending the bulk of their time doing engineering. And then really just focused on investing a fair amount in the factory that engineers use to produce software, like the desktop experience, the CI/CD pipelines, how we manage code, how we think about that. Just investing in that to make it efficient and productive and in some ways democratic so that all the engineers can contribute to how they work.
If I should add anything, Brendan, totally agree to all of that. It's probably one shift that I'm trying to drive is to get the engineers closer to the problem as opposed to implementing a solution. So I've found in the past as well that engineers, and I'm an engineer too, right? So I can relate to it. But the closer you get to the actual problem, the more interesting your work becomes, because you can actually see the impact that I'm having towards the customers of the bank and to society at large. So getting engineers closer to the problem as opposed to, if you want to put it to the extreme, translating English into code. That's probably not the ambition that any engineer would have. You want to be part of the problem solving and understanding what outcomes you deliver.
So in terms of bringing engineers closer to the problem, does that involve co-locating the engineers in the different parts or different units of the bank? How do you see that taking shape?
So very much expanding on what Brendan alluded to before about the squads. So we're trying to set up a cross-functional persistent teams where you would have the engineers being an integral part of it, and even in the ideal case, a majority of that team. So you would have a persistent team around a particular business function so that they can really delve into what is the customer experience, how can we help customers, how can we optimize the product, and so on, as opposed to just having a business requirement being fed to them. So it's really a deeper understanding. And even if we don't co-locate them physically these days, so we've learned other ways of working where we have to connect virtually, but you're part of a persistent cross-functional team, whether you're physically co-located or not.
And just for Brendan, on the desktop experience side and the CI/CD pipelines and tooling, obviously this is a really big area within software development. Developers often like to bring in their own tools and have specific ways of working. I imagine this is a particularly important element in terms of your recruitment drive and strategy as well.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that it's actually a fundamental thing for any organization to take the leap and become a true software company, which we believe we are becoming or well on the way to with our existing 5,000 engineers. If you look at the tech companies, in some ways, everything from the experience, the IDEs that people write their code in, through to how they deploy, how they look at each other's code, how you kind of manage code as a community, how you define your APIs, and then ultimately how you test and deploy that code. That's almost like the secret sauce for the tech giant, in my opinion. And I think in some ways it's almost also like the central nervous system of engineering. So there's some bits like the path to production and CI/CD where really you want to land on one way that works for everyone and just optimize that. Give people a lot of choices, but make the middle path as clear and as easy to use as possible so that there's no real reason to consider alternatives unless there's a really specific reason that the default way doesn't work. And then sort of right at the start of that, closest to the developer, it's to give them as much freedom as possible to work in their own way. Some people like really old-fashioned text editors for writing code. Most developers like more modern IDEs, but also things like language selection. We're trying to let developers to some extent self-select what languages they code in, and particularly if they're going to move towards more modern languages that are fit for purpose for their individual task. But we're also working hard on maintaining that balance. So if you want to use a new language, you have to have a certain number of people to write standards and specifications around that and to do peer review across the organization on each other's codes. So we're very focused on finding that balance. We're definitely heading in a great direction.
And maybe just to move topics, I had a question around the strategies in both of your respective parts of the organization. So Brendan around the technology side of things and Fredrik around the digital strategy. So I was interested in getting an idea from both of you around the pillars of strategy in each of your areas, but also in terms of the alignment and where there are linkages between what both of you are doing.
I'll go with the high-level tech strategy, and then I think Fredrik can talk about the alignment and his digital strategy or the group's digital strategy. I feel like our tech strategy is quite simple to think about and quite difficult to execute. For things that aren't differentiating as much as possible, we want to use software as a service and sort of move them out of the way, not spend too much time, not waste a lot of our smartest people on that. Just move to SaaS for those. And then for the spaces that differentiate, we are focusing on high quality reusable software components that are sort of understood by our entire community and which kind of form good APIs that eventually become software assets that any developer can use and interact with. And for core things, we want to have one API that does something and sort of minimize how much is strictly related to one BU or one product. So on what we build, definitely API driven, and as much as possible where it makes sense, embracing cloud native tech. Because as much as you can stop looking at your own storage and stop looking at systems engineering and start looking at software engineering for everything, the better you are. And then the last part at the high level is probably just getting the best people. And that's engineers, but it's also data scientists and cyber specialists. And then to attract them at some of those things we've talked about before, like the best environment for them to work in, really attractive career paths, great training.
From a digital perspective, first of all, long-term digital does not equal the app or the website or NetBank or any of that when you take it to a broader perspective. Right now, that is what people talk about. So apps are still what people associate with digital banking, perhaps, but there's going to be an expiry date to that too. The apps came about with the iPhone in 2007 or so and has been predominant in the digital context since. But there's an expiry date to that. So I try to help the organization realize that at some point, digital will mean a lot more than just the app. And I think what will happen is banking as we know it will become to an extent invisible and commoditized. And then banks like CBA will need to figure out what's the value proposition to our customers in such an environment. And this is going to be accelerated now, I think, with 5G and interconnected services. And as we go deeper into open banking and so on. Somewhere in the future, there is a world where banking will be part of an interconnected ecosystem. Now, we need to figure out exactly what role do we play there and how do we transition into that. So that's one thing that we're working on. The other piece then is before we get to that, what do we do? And I think in order to position ourselves, both for the long-term future, but also in the medium term, outstanding user experience is the key. And outstanding user experience through our digital channels. We are investing a lot in personalization, driven by the fact that I think people expect the same things and appreciate the same things digitally as they do in the physical world. So if you walk into a shop and say, hey, Mr. Hopper, how's the family? How's the dog? Brendan will respond well to it. Whereas if you met with just a blank face and they don't know who you are, they don't know why you're walking into the shop and whatever it might be, experience is not so good. So we need to personalize our offering a lot more to be able to continue to excel in our user experience. So we're investing a lot in that, obviously, again, then requiring heavy efforts from our engineers. So far, so good, but it's absolutely a cornerstone of our digital strategy, personalization and continuing to provide outstanding UX.
So there's a couple of areas I want to dig into there for both of you, but maybe just to stick with Fredrik. I'm glad you raised this point about digitalization because this was something I think I read in the Qantas magazine around your comments around sort of misconceptions in the area. And specifically what resonated with me was something that has been coming up in a few conversations actually, which is that digital has this broader impact on physical operations, which is something that doesn't get discussed very much. As you say, it kind of gets compartmentalized into apps and this small kind of area around online first or online only experiences. Whereas there's this whole bigger impact of what digital can do from a much broader perspective around hybrid operations or around the bricks and mortar environment. So I'm really sort of interested in your thoughts around that.
So I think it's interesting. The way banks have been operating is very much, we still have the same underlying processes and products in many cases that we have then translated into something digital. And that has a very negative effect on UX typically, because if we had the courage to forget about what we have and just design something, given the digital capabilities that we now do have at our fingertips, what would we design? And it would look very different. It would feel very different. So we're starting to see all over the place, not just at CBA, but in the industry, many players taking that step back and trying to design with digital fast mindset. In some areas, we're also starting to see new products, new things, new services coming in that didn't have a physical precedence, which I think are the really interesting ones, where you now start to design new experiences, new products with digital capabilities that never had a predecessor in the physical world. Much more to come as things really become interconnected, I think, but it's starting to show up.
And just on the personalization side of things that you mentioned, obviously this is more around the front end experience and the building of future sort of capabilities and future digital experiences. Can you give us a sense of what that might look like? Obviously, when you think about personalization and even some of the things that you were mentioning around knowing a customer before they enter, that kind of speaks almost to the promise of CRM for a lot of years, where the whole idea was you'd be able to bring up a screen at some point and have the last interactions described to you. Obviously, CBA has done a lot more on personalization on that front with some of the work with Pega and other things, but it'd be useful to, I guess, understand what more you can do from a personalization standpoint.
So I think very much around that is going to revolve around simplifying the experience. If you look into our assets, and I think most banking assets today, it is, again, sort of a replica of the traditional branch experience. Everything is there. So I'm Swedish by passport, so I tend to do a lot of IKEA analogies, and I've been using this one many places. But I wonder if we don't have more products than IKEA sometimes, because you get a lot of stuff in there, and it's hard to navigate around. So my point is personalization is going to be used to selecting the ingredients that we would show. So you would log in and see the stuff that is relevant to you only. There will be a lot of stuff that we still have on the shelves or in the magazine that we don't need to show you, so we won't. And similarly for Brendan, it'll be his personalized experience. So I'm trying to figure out a way where we can drive what Salesforce talk about as a segment of one and saying what you see is unique to you and so on. So taking a lot of stuff out that, as tempting as it might be as a banker to throw all your good products out there, it's not going to be relevant to the customer. And sometimes you're even going to confuse them with it. So filtering it out and really driving towards a segment of one. The industry has done a good job so far in trying to derive personas. So you would have maybe 5 or maybe 6 different versions of the app or the channel, depending on who you are and what your needs are. But I think we need to take it many steps further and really making it truly dynamic, depending on who you are.
And Brendan, just to bring you back in, you're talking in your comments around undifferentiated work versus differentiated work. So undifferentiated stuff, push it to SaaS as much as possible. The differentiated stuff, the stuff that you were developing, you were looking around a lot of aspects of reusability. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more to the reusability side of things and the work that you're doing there. Is that a point in time where you're just kind of thinking, well, okay, everything from this point on, we're going to try and create components that are reusable in different architectural setups? Or are you looking back in time as well and trying to pick things that are already created and saying, okay, well, look, these could be compartmentalized or containerized in some fashion and reused in future projects?
Probably more the former than the latter. There's still going to be some systems that we need to maintain ourselves that aren't truly differentiating. And they're probably like, you put them in a modern wrapper, you containerize them. You don't have to worry so much about patching or testing, and you can go a little bit faster. For the truly differentiating stuff, we're talking about fully embracing inner source. I'm not Swedish, I'm Australian, so I'll probably use a food analogy rather than an IKEA one. Software's food in the fridge. You approach software a few years ago, you'd be like, your customer-facing assets has to change every month, and your back-end assets, they've got a 5-year expiration date. Nah, everything has to be constantly kept fresh. The things that touch the customer, maybe they have to be refreshed every week. The back-end, maybe that has to be refreshed every month. But anything older than 3 months, you should really consider before you take a bite. What that means is all your source code's in one place and all your engineers have access to look at it and inspect it. And you give your engineers and all your architects and a bunch of other people dedicated time to groom it and improve it and focus on tech debt. And you treat tech debt as just another first order type of work alongside features. and you make sure that all of your ecosystem is being used and end-to-end is being maintained properly. And if you don't really use something, if it's not being leveraged, get rid of it. Work out how you decommission it from your code base and from production. And then the other thing where I think that becomes actually really important and useful is when you start tying that to engineer career progression. If you write a module that's used by a lot of engineers who rate it highly and who highly vote on it being good, that helps you get a promotion. If you review a lot of code and find a lot of issues and areas for improvement, and you coach a lot of engineers, that means you're probably at a more senior level than someone who doesn't. So kind of tying how we think about engineers and their careers with how we think about maintaining the food in the fridge that is our software is actually probably what I'm talking about there in terms of the differentiating software development and building assets.
Excellent. And you mentioned inner source there very briefly. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your inner source work or the way that you're approaching inner source?
We're quite early on in our inner source journey, but we are definitely looking at, first of all, how do we make sure that our people, but also our vendors and partners and people who do engineering for us, because we're not all employees, how do we make sure that they can see each other's code? And then we're starting to work out how do we metricate the review of other people's code? Like how do we actually start rewarding engineers for looking around and understanding the ecosystem and helping outside of their space? And then we've flagged a few initiatives and we'll be flagging more as actually inner source initiatives. One example is our cloud native patterns, cloud native components that we want every team to be able to use. We're fully embracing inner source for that. So there's a project, there's funding available. If people want to work on a reusable component for cloud, we expect our entire engineering team to be able to chip in and develop that. And then central teams will be far more focused on maintaining the quality and reviewing the pull requests and the contributions rather than actually just developing everything centrally.
Maybe just to move into the cloud side of things, you've given a good seg there in terms of the patterns that you're developing. And so I had some questions around the building blocks and the governance frameworks and the sort of scale migration processes that have been put in place. Are you able to maybe just talk a little bit to what's going on in that specific area? Because obviously there's a much bigger goal in terms of CBA pushing a lot of stuff over to public cloud, but it's always interesting to hear the back-end processes and the things that are going to get you across the line from a scale migration perspective.
There's a few things that we're doing in parallel. First and foremost, we want to move properly as much as we can. We modernize, not just shift. But at the same time, we do have a large amount of infrastructure that we're virtualizing and we're moving across into containerized environments. That just gives you more capacity to be able to spend time on more useful things than looking after tin and systems in a data center. At the same time, by shifting the system gravity and the data gravity and picking that up and moving it onto the cloud side, you make modernization far easier. AWS numbers show that porting your on-prem assets and virtualizing them and shipping them across as containers roughly speeds up your modernization by about 2.5 times, which is massive. So we are focused on that. We've got a lot of velocity. In terms of the modernization, it's really hard to say when you're done, what does done look like? Because like I said, it's food in the fridge. You have to constantly keep it fresh to be modern. Something we modernize this year is still going to be old next year if we don't keep focusing on it. So in terms of that, it's very much about making sure the core products have sustained investment and product teams built around them, but also training our people. And we originally had a goal, which was like we want 1,000 100 level engineers. But we're actually thinking far more about we want a pyramid. We want 100, 400 level AWS engineers and similar on the Microsoft stack. And then if that naturally means we get a much broader base and hundreds of engineers at the 100 and 200 levels, so be it. But we really do need a lot of the leadership, the distinguished engineers and the chief engineers and the principal engineers to really understand the value of cloud native, but also the trade-offs, where it's safe to do that and where you have to use more conventional methods.
And just to bring both of you back in here, I'm wondering what's the biggest challenge that you see in your respective roles at CBA at the moment?
Many to choose from, but we tried to pick one that is close to this topic. I think it is a big shift in the mindset of how do you approach solving problems? Because ultimately what we try to do is by bringing engineers closer to the problems, we're trying to get to better outcomes quicker. That's at the heart of it. But it's a different way of operating for the whole organization. It's going to be much more product-oriented, much less project-oriented. That also means, as I said before, the persistent teams. It also means that, to Brendan's point from before, if you build something, you own it. So you can't just build something and throw it to the back of the fridge and hope for somebody else to come and clean it up at some point. It doesn't work like that. So you have to take a much higher degree of ownership of your work. So it's a mindset shift for everyone in the organization, not just the engineers, but also the people surrounding the engineers. And some of it comes easily because everyone feels the benefits, and some of it doesn't come as easily because you have to find new ways of going about your work. So it's a big shift, and it's a big organization. There's 5,000 engineers, as we've said, 40,000 employees in total. So it's a big mammoth to turn around.
My top challenge is quite related to that. It's bringing in the talent we need to sort of drive the change forward. As much as we're aspiring to operate like a tech company and to have the same sort of engineering central nervous system as a Google or an AWS or a Microsoft, I'll be really honest that we're not quite there yet. And we need people who are used to that environment to come in and help us build that environment and to get that as our engineering culture and to build that stack. It's pretty hard to attract those people when it's not that yet, when we don't yet have all of it. So it's a kind of iterative process as we edge closer to operating more and more like a tech company in how we develop software. We're more and more attracted to that kind of people, but it is tough and we're not there yet. There's still a couple of years to go, in my opinion, before we're all the way there and we can have an absolute similar development experience to one of the tech giants. Like I said before, great engineers don't really want to convince people on what great engineering looks like or talk about engineering. They want to do engineering. So that's a really tough dynamic.
And just a related question to this, what excites you about maybe the next 12 months or even beyond that period?
I can start. So I can talk about the reason why I wanted to join CBA a year ago, and it still holds true. The appetite to do good with technology is just immense. I mean, if you look to the interest, even someone like our CEO, Matt Comyn, takes in technology, I don't think you'll find that many places in banking, for sure. It is just astonishing. So look at things like what we're doing now with our benefits finder that has been in the press recently, right, where we help people connect with benefits from governments that they haven't been able to find, or maybe they weren't even aware that they were entitled to. So there are a ton of interesting problems to solve, and I think technology plays an enormously important role in it. I've seen banks all over the world, really, and it's pretty unique in the appetite that we've got and the muscles that we put behind it. I think that's an awesome challenge to step into. Now, does that translate into a lot of work? Well, absolutely, but I'm quite happy taking my part of it.
The thing I'm most excited about is probably the dual things of end-to-end digitization and transparency. And I think that we're going to be able to unlock a lot of that over the next couple of years. And if you think about like Uber versus taxis, even taxis and apps, the reason why I personally think one is a much better experience is that while I'm waiting for the car or the food, I can see where it is and what the driver's doing and it's on the way. And that transparency just makes me feel a lot better about it. And the same thing, like if you look at the innovation at Domino's, I love the fact you can order a pizza and watch it get cooked and then see on the map, like as soon as it comes out of the oven, you can look at it, you see on the map where it is, you see it on the screen before you hear the bike come down the street. I think in the next couple of years, we're going to start getting there for banking. I'd love to be able to have a home loan that you see cook and the minimum amount of manual processes as we digitize those, being able to give our customers the abilities to look at where they are in a process and have that absolute transparency of, oh, like I actually have to do a step myself in the same way that you'd order a pizza, I think is going to be fundamental. And I think that it's going to be a really virtuous cycle as we start to build products like that. We're going to start to be able to get more and more excited engineers and talented people and data scientists and people wanting to come and work with us and work on those problems. And then we're just going to be able to exponentially innovate. I'm super excited about digitization and transparency.
It is a super interesting environment and it is a super interesting time. It's not just banking, it is all over. Digitalization is coming big time. As I said, I think with 5G and interconnected services at scale, everything is going to get interconnected one way or another. And as engineers and as technologists, the place that we have in all that is just, to me, astonishing and fantastic. It's just a great experience. So tons of work for all of us. Engineers are not going to be out of work.
If any engineers are listening and they want to talk about a job or a career at CommBank, Email eng@cba.com.au.
That was Fredrik Lindström and Brendan Hopper from CBA. And that's the podcast for this week. We'll be back with an exciting new interview next week. Until then, you can catch all the latest headlines in Australian IT over at itnews.com.au.